Welcome to the final of our winter lectures for 2026. My name is Mike Zarfos. I'm the Executive Director of Great Mountain Forest. We're grateful to our Winter Lectures Series sponsors, Molly Ackerley and Michael Sconiers, with additional thanks to Andrew Thompson and of Pikeman Studios, Chris Keys in the Norfolk Library, and of course Vicki Nelson, our Program Coordinator and Chef for the evening. If there are any certified forest practitioners here, Connecticut certified forest practitioners, we will be issuing a continuing education unit at the end of the talk, so come find me. At Great Mountain Forest, we work to bring forests and people together. Northeastern forests support extraordinary biodiversity, including hundreds of plant species that live quietly in our understories. This diversity is vulnerable to climate change and invasive plants. I know there's a lot of invasive plant enthusiasts in the room. Yet healthy, well-managed forests can also help us combat climate change by storing carbon while strengthening ecosystem resilience to these invasive species. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Sara Kuebbing, an ecologist at the Yale School of the Environment and Director of Research for the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, which connects researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to advance sustainable land management. Also in July, she will be joining the faculty as an assistant professor of temperate forest resilience, and we're looking forward to working with her in that capacity. Dr. Kuebbing was a co-author on a chapter of the U.S. Department of Energy's important Roads to Removal report, exploring how forest management can help the United States to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Her research has also examined invasive plant species, how they spread, how they interact, and how climate change is reshaping competition between natives and invasives in our forests, which is complicated but very important work. We're excited about a recent opportunity to collaborate with Dr. Kuebbing on research examining how forest diseases influence carbon storage and what that means for future management and policy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sara Kuebbing.
All right, thank you all for coming out on a Saturday, and thank you Mike and the Great Mountain Forest team for hosting here. This is such a beautiful spot. I was imagining my little New Haven library branch and like the little back room, and this is just so much more lovely than I could have ever imagined, so thank you so much. So as Mike mentioned, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of our more recent research that is going on with my research group, but I want to start actually just to share a little bit about this relatively new program that we just started about 4 years ago at Yale called the Applied Science Synthesis Program, and that's the group that I'm directing right now. I'm the director of research for them. And then I couldn't really decide. Mike made me very excited about a lot of my research when I chatted with him to accept this talk, and so I'm going to give you like some different slivers of some of the work. I'm going to talk a little bit about some relatively recent work on forest plant biodiversity and how it is potentially not resilient to both the interactions between climate warming and invasion. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about forest carbon resilience, and so management for forests under these changing conditions, which was part of the Roads to Removal report that Mike mentioned. So first, I just want to talk about what is this Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, and why do we exist at Yale, and why do we start? Well, we're an initiative. We're funded through a new center at Yale called the Center for Natural Carbon Capture, which is a center that promotes scientific research for natural solutions in climate mitigation. And of course, forests are one of the main pillars in which we can think about climate mitigation efforts. We also were housed at the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment, which is all about taking real-world research and translating it and working with management on the ground, and that's been the ethos of the forestry program at Yale since its inception 126 now years ago. So I joined YCNCC and YSC as a research scientist about 5 years ago, where we launched this program. And I realized that our name, Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program, is a really big jumble of words that even sometimes the dean of the School of the Environment doesn't quite get in the right order. And so I want to actually walk you through what we mean by this and what we're trying to achieve. And really what we're trying to achieve is something really simple. We're trying to help people make decisions. And really specifically, we're trying to help people make decisions about landscapes that they managed. And so the forestry program at Yale started as a forestry program, and so we do a lot of work in forests, and that's of course my love and where I spend a lot of my time. But we're also expanding out to croplands, we did a fun project with ocean spray cranberry and cranberry wetlands. We're thinking about silvopasture research in the tropics and adding, cattle to grazing lands, or even some work on plantations and restoration in other places. And so we know that these ecosystems are really important for preserving a lot of the values, the cultural benefits, the economic benefits, the biodiversity benefits, and now we really talk a lot about the climate benefits. And so there's a lot of information that people need to decide what they should or should not, or what they could or could not be doing in these landscapes. And so one of the ways that we try to work really well is that if we need to know what decisions people need to make, we have to go and actually ask them. And so this is a really critical part of our program where we want people to make decisions, and so we say we do applied science, because we go out and we ask people what they need, and then we work together with those collaborators to come up with the data and the streams that they need. And so after a couple years, we have a really nice collection. I should have thrown up Great Mountain Forest as one of our newest collaborators, but we've found a lot of interest in a lot of different people who are really willing to share with us what data needs they need and what they need to make decisions on. And so we've had some really great collaborations from national to international organizations to a lot of folks who are managing a lot of different types of ecosystems. We also work really broadly, not just across the School of the Environment, but we collaborate with a really interdisciplinary team of researchers. We work with folks at the School of Architecture. We are just starting a collaboration with the School of Public Health, because we realize that a lot of these decisions that we need to make about ecosystems have to do more than just the ecology, which is where I bring in expertise, but it has to do with social science and economics and cultural values and anthropology. And so we reach out to colleagues across Yale and even across universities to bring in the expertise that we need. The second thing that we do is, usually when people make decisions, they don't want to hear a scientist say, "That's great, let me write a grant, we'll wait a year to see whether we got the grant, then I'll hire people, and in 10 years I will give you your answer." That's generally not what people are looking for. So instead, a lot of what we do at the program is we rely on existing data streams that already exist, because those data streams are rich and they can be mined to answer these questions, but they also move a little bit faster. And so that's why we say we do applied science synthesis, because a lot of the work we do is synthesizing existing data, so we don't have to tell people that you need to wait 10 years for us to go out and wait for the seedlings to grow to us to give you an answer. And so that's a little bit about what we do. I'd be happy to chat a little bit more about this program that we're building and some of the many other projects. We're a really large team, so I'm going to give you a little sliver of some of the work that I've been doing on, but we've got a lot of other fun stuff happening, and happy to answer any questions about that. All right, so getting more into the meat of some of the current research that I've been spending my time thinking on, I first want to dive into, I'm real tired of winter. I'm really excited that tomorrow is March. So it made me really happy to put all these spring ephemeral wildflowers up on the screen to show you that I really hope we're going to be seeing in not too long, as soon as all this latest snowfall melts. But some of the work I've been doing is actually thinking a lot about these wildfires and thinking, are these forest plant biodiversity resilient to climate warming and invasion? And one thing that I think is really interesting about temperate forest ecosystems, someone recently just quantified this, actually a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh, where I was before here, that over 80% of the plant biodiversity in temperate forests in North America are below our knees. So these little plants here, and a lot of others, represent most of the plant diversity in the forest. It's not the shrubs, it's not the trees, it's the things that we sometimes are trampling over as we walk through the forest. And so this is a really critical component of plant biodiversity in forested ecosystems that, and these are some of the most charismatic species that we have here. But if we want to think about protecting biodiversity, thinking about protecting these understory plants is a really great place to start. And so if you're a little tiny herb that only maybe grows up to your knees, one thing that makes it really hard to grow in a forest is plants need light. And light's really hard to find once those trees leaf out and all those shrubs leaf out and reducing the light. And so this is a wildflower's eye view of what the forest looks like in early spring. And a lot of those species, in fact, all of those species I showed you on the last slide and a whole host of others, are really capitalizing on this early spring light window before the trees leaf out, before the shrubs leaf out. And some of these species are getting over 90% of their carbon budget in this time. So if they don't have this early spring light window, they might not fruit or flower that year. And if that happens year on year, then it's probably not going to be great for that individual or for that population of plants. And so this is like a really interesting feature of what we see in our forests, and it's why some of these wildflowers come out so early. But I think we might have a little bit of an issue in our forest in terms of both invasion by non-native plant species and climate change. And so to explain a little bit about why I think invasive plants might reduce wildflower resilience, I'm going to start with these pictures. The one on your left was taken just not too far from New Haven in North Branford, Connecticut in May. The one in April was taken right near my in-laws' house in Wilmington, Delaware. But the thing that's hard to see from these pictures, because they are far away, is that almost everything green that you can see in these pictures are a non-native introduced species. And when I say non-native invasive, I mean a plant that humans have introduced, typically from faraway places. A lot of ours come from Western Europe and Eastern Asia. And that humans have intentionally brought over, and they have spread sort of beyond where we've initially planted them into our forested ecosystems. And so here's a whole host of species. Probably many of the room are familiar in it. This was I'm going to walk away, sorry for the thing. These are some little spring beauties right here. Is there celandine up here? Yes. Lesser celandine? Yeah, this is huge. This has been in Wilmington for a while. I just was so sad for these little spring beauties that were like coming out of the lesser celandine along this riparian riverbank. So we see that there's this unique sort of phenological signature of these non-native plants in these ecosystems. And phenology is the timing in which organisms do the things that they do, when they leaf out, when they flower, when they reproduce. And so we're seeing this really unique phenological signature with non-native invasive plants in our temperate forest ecosystems. The other thing that I'm highlighting here on these slides is all of those blue arrows. Those are all actually introduced non-native shrubs. So those are things that are growing, and it'll become more apparent, above our wildflowers. So they grow sort of mid-level below the trees. And I think they're doing the same thing that our wildflowers are doing, which is exploiting this early spring light window where they're getting their leaves out and they're doing a lot of photosynthesis work. They're getting a lot of carbon and energy resources, so then they can persist in that forest understory even after it closes. So here's just another photo to show you the real differences now, not just between our non-native shrubs, which is a burning bush shrub over on the right. This is from a forest in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You can see it's fully leafed out. And then in the background, those little light green leaves are really light green and they're really tiny. And that's our native shrub species, spice bush, which is really common up and down the eastern United States. And so you can see this like clear phenological signature. But on this same day in Pittsburgh, if you put your camera underneath, you now see what wildflowers are seen underneath these two shrubs. And so we have our spice bush with its little tiny leaves on the left, lots of light coming in. And we have that burning bush over on the right, where you can see how much light is being intercepted just because that plant has already leafed out. And if you ask folks who work in your lab to go out every week and measure the light levels through the early spring, what we can see is that some of these invasives that have this really early spring phenology are reducing light levels by about 30% relative to the native spice bush. So if you're a wildflower, it really matters not only that you're in a forest, but what types of species you're growing under in that forest and how much light you're getting in the early spring. And so that's why I think invasion might be an issue for some of these early spring wildflowers that form the bulk of our diversity. But what about climate warming? Well, we've done some work. This was with some great collaborators at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History and a PhD student of mine, Rachel Reeve, who's on the left at the top corner, where we use the collections at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History to look at what's been happening through time in terms of plant leaf out. And so Rachel went into the museum, she looked at the museum records, and one of the really cool things about museum records, I promised I wouldn't do this, but I'm going to, is that every record has a little tag on it that says where the plant species has been collected, what date it's been collected. And then we can look at those and we can say, look, it was collected on that date and it's flowering, or it was collected on this date and it was fruiting. The other cool thing that my colleague Mason Heberly does is he finds plant species that were collected 100 years ago, and he goes back out and he collects them again at the same time from the same location. And what he's demonstrated through that is there's this shift in what we're seeing happening in phenology. And so all these little dots that we see here on this graph represent one herbarium specimen. And so what we can do is we can plot by the year that that specimen was collected, and then we can look at all the ones that were fruiting, what day of the year it was fruiting. And I think this represents about 20 species that are common in Pennsylvania. And so what this graph is just showing, that is through time, plants are in Pennsylvania, of these 20 species, are fruiting earlier as we get closer in time than they were in the past. And we know also there's a correlation between temperature and time. But we can pick up this signal. And other folks have done this for other species around the world using these herbarium records. And we see this shift overall in time of when plants are leafing out. But here's the interesting thing. So this wasn't that exciting of a pattern to find because we weren't the first people to go and do this. But then what we did is we said, okay, let's look at native and non-native plants. And so now the purple dots are our non-native plants, and the green dots represent our native plants. And we can take those date signatures that are on the herbarium records, and we can match it with historical climate data. We know roughly how warm it was in the year and the month in which that plant was collected. And so now, instead of plotting year, I'm plotting whether the temperature in the month and year in which that plant was collected was colder or warmer than average. And what we can see here is this clear signal that our non-native plants seem to be actually increasing their fruiting time at a faster rate than our native plants. So what that means is, let's say for every degree it's warmer in May, the non-native plants have advanced their phenology. They've advanced it faster than with the native plants. And that's sort of what we are seeing in those pictures too, the little tiny leaves of the spice bush versus those big, fully grown leaves of the burning bush. So this is a really interesting pattern, and it suggests that our native and non-native plants, they're experiencing the same temperatures, they're experiencing the same climate warming, but they're also doing something different in response to that. And so I think it's really interesting to say, well, why is that? Why might these introduced species be doing something different? And so there's a couple of reasons that we might think about that. One actually might be that where these species are evolved. So remember, these species we've actually taken from places where they've existed for thousands to tens of thousands of years, depending on the species, and they've evolved in different climates. And so this is a map by another researcher, Konstantin Zoner, where he created a map that showed spring temperature variability. And so the reds and the yellows on the map are showing places where in the early spring, and this week is such a great example, so I love giving this talk when we're in the spring, it's like in the 30s right now. It might be in the 60s, or at least in New Haven, on Thursday. We get these wild temperature swings. So these hot areas, these warm areas on the map are showing you places where spring temperatures are really variable. You get these huge temperature swings. It's cold, it's hot, it's cold, it's hot. It's not like that everywhere in the world. And especially in places like Western Europe and Eastern Asia, spring's actually pretty consistent there. You're gonna need your coat every day, and it's gonna slowly get warmer. And so what this map tells us is that plants that evolved in Eastern North America, They don't know what to do. It's warming, but it might be a cold snap 2 weeks later. And that's really problematic if you're a plant. You don't want to leaf out and have a cold snap, or you don't want to flower and have a cold snap. That's not great. So if you evolved in Eastern North America under these really variable temperature regimes, it's possible that you're really conservative and that you don't use spring warming as a signal that spring's about to come. But if you've evolved in Western Europe or Eastern Asia, where there's a steady signal, and as it gets warmer and it ramps up, you know spring is right around the corner, then you've potentially evolved to say, this spring temperature signal is definitely a reliable signal. I know that I can leaf out now. So that's our first hypothesis, that these invaders that come from Western Europe and Eastern Asia are more responsive to these spring warming temperatures because they've evolved to understand it to be a really reliable signal. And we sort of see this. This is another herbarium study, this time looking at a bunch of wildflowers and trees from forests across all of these continents. And we can see that, this is an aside. As an aside, we also see that not just invasives are changing their timing, but the different functional forms in the forest are also responding differently to temperatures. And so this figure, Ben Lee, a postdoc who worked with me in Pittsburgh, looked at a bunch of herbarium specimens of trees and wildflowers from Asia, Europe, and North America, and looked at their response, which is this spring temperature sensitivity. So for every degree of warming that happens, how much earlier are we likely to see a plant leafing out? And we found this really interesting pattern that sort of confirms what we saw. In North America, we see that our trees are responding more to spring warming than our forest wildflowers. So, but we're not finding that same signal in Asia and Europe, where we have that regular, consistent temperature signal. And so this is signaling to us that something else is also going on here in North America with this high spring variation, which is not just that it's variable, but that our trees, whose leaf buds are in the air, and our wildflowers, who are actually existing below ground in the soil, are also responding differently to these temperatures. And so this graph over here on the right is showing you I buried these temperature, little tiny things that look like quarters. I took a bunch of those and we put them out in the forest and we buried them below ground and we put them on top of the leaf litter and we put some up in sort of the shrub layer, and then we found someone who was willing to climb trees for us and put it all the way up into the top of the trees. And we measured through spring, through winter and spring, we actually did this over a couple years, just daily mean temperatures. And so what you can see in this figure here is sort of what you would expect if you thought about, and we did this all in the same place. We found different trees and we buried something right at the base of the tree and we put it up in the top of the tree. And so what you can see is that those monitors that were up in the tree canopy, the temperatures are fluctuating like wild because they're up in the tree. The air temperatures change a lot. The soil, it's like the ocean. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of heat to warm it up. It takes a lot to cool it down. And so you see way less variability in our below ground sensors. And so what that tells us is that in the forest, these species are shrubs and our trees that have their leaf buds up in the air. They're actually experiencing different temperatures than our wildflowers that are existing below the ground. And so we also think something might be happening between the functional forms of these plants, that we might be seeing differences in how they respond to spring because they're actually experiencing pretty different environmental variables. And so we wanted to test this idea, and the way we did this was we went out into our forest. This is one of our sensors that we duct taped in a plastic bag to a tree. But we went out into the forest, we planted these common gardens of all these wildflowers, we tagged a bunch of woody trees and shrubs, and then we let them exist in the forest. And every once in a while, starting in January, we would go out in the forest and we would take clippings of these plants. And we brought them back to the lab and we would dig up some of those pots of wildflowers and we would bring those back to the lab and we would put them in growth chambers. And all of my colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, who are mostly cellular biologists and working with pipettes, And rat lines couldn't understand what I was doing carrying twigs into the lab in January. But I promised them that this was going to be a cool experiment. And so we put them in growth chambers, and we set the growth chambers to either an ambient spring temperature for Pittsburgh, where we did this work, or a warm spring temperature, where we increased the temperature by 5 degrees Celsius. And we put them in there, and what was really cool is we could monitor. They started to come out. They responded to our spring warming. They would leaf out, they would flower, and we could count how many days it took for them to do this within our warm or our ambient temperature. The other thing that we could do is we could repeat these collections. So we repeated these collections twice, once in January and once in late February. And what that allowed us to do then was to allow the plants to experience longer winters and colder winters, the later collection, versus warmer winters and shorter winters, the January collection. And so we did that a couple times, and I'm going to walk you through what this graph is going to show you, which are the sum of the results from this experiment. And so the panels on the left are our native species, our trees, our shrubs, and our wildflowers. And the panels on the right are our non-native species, our trees, our shrubs, and our wildflowers. And I have a bunch of dots that I'm going to populate this with that are either showing the effect of spring warming, a warm winter or a cool winter, which we simulated by either collecting those plants in January or late February, and the effects of winter chilling in a warm spring or an ambient spring, which is those temperatures that we expose these plants to in the growth chamber. And so one thing we can look at is we can say, okay, what were our native shrubs really responsive to? And so the relative effect of temperature cues, our native shrubs really needed that cold winter warming. Those were the cold winter chilling. They really needed to be out in the cold. That was where we saw differences of these temperature cues compared to the warming temperatures. They didn't really care whether we put them in a warm chamber or an ambient chamber. That didn't change the number of days until they leafed out or flowered. What changed was the cool winter chilling periods. So we're seeing a signal that our native shrubs really need long cold winters before they're going to leaf out in the spring. They're not responsive to these warm temperatures, which is sort of what we expected. So coming back to our hypotheses, one was that, remember, we think that these non-natives might be more sensitive to spring warming than our natives. And we did find some evidence of that for both our shrubs and our wildflowers. So you can see the native plants really didn't care that much about the warming temperatures because those lines are crossing zero or they're very close to zero. Whereas our wildflowers and our shrubs, they were responding more to our spring warming. So we found some weak evidence that something's going on between our non-natives and our native shrubs where they're using these spring warming temperatures to change. We also found that the functional form, woody plants versus wildflowers also, where woody plants were much more sensitive to winter chilling, especially, again, our native species, relative to our wildflowers that didn't seem very responsive. And remember, that's because they're in the soil, and that soil is relatively warm throughout the winter, especially winters when we have heavy snow like this, so they're buffered from that chilling. So they're not using winter chilling as much of a signal as our shrubs and trees. And so coming back around to sort of thinking of this big picture, what does it mean if you're a wildflower in the forest that's invaded and is experiencing climate warming? And I think what some of these experimental results demonstrate is that these wildflowers are potentially going to start losing that light window, because if these, especially if they're growing underneath non-native shrubs, if these non-native shrubs are responding more quickly to spring warming than the wildflowers, then it means they're going to start leafing out earlier than these wildflowers are going to come up. And it's going to be closing that early light window, which might have some reproductive consequences for all of these species. But of course, this was just one growth chamber experiment, sort of suggesting, but luckily, my colleague at Pittsburgh and I set up a field experiment to actually test whether there would be consequences in spring warming. And so we are actually in year 6 of this research, where we have a bunch of common gardens, again, out in the field, where we have 20 different species of wildflowers growing beneath plots. And every spring, even since I've left Pittsburgh, Mason has gone back out to the forest and he's put shade cloth over some of those plots. And we put that shade cloth out before the tree canopy leaves out. So we're going out and we're sort of simulating what an early spring with an early tree canopy leaf out looks like. And so one of those rows of plots, we have 4 of these common gardens across this forested site. One of those rows of plots, we simulate early spring leaf out by putting the shade cloth on, and then we pull it off once the trees actually leaf out and are providing that shade. And then the other row, we actually leave that shade cloth on throughout the summer to simulate what it would be like to be a wildflower growing underneath some of these invasive shrubs. And we've just recruited a great postdoc who's going to come work with me at Yale, Olivia Voigt, who just finished her PhD at University of Michigan. And Olivia's not here, but we have literally hundreds of thousands of rows of data of monitoring the phenology and the physiology of all these different wildflowers that we've been tracking through time. And so I'm really excited for her to be able to dig into this data and tell us what does it actually mean if we expect these plants to have these closing spring light windows. What does it mean for their physiology? And so Mike will have to invite me back here in a couple of years for me to give you the results of this, but really excited to sort of see what we find from this long-term experiment.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
How come they collected that data for such a long time?
Well, we had Mason and I had a grant from the National Science Foundation from back in, we got the grant in January of 2020. And we had actually done some preliminary work setting up these common gardens. And so we were actually, because of the pandemic, which disrupted a lot of research, we were actually able to sort of use that funding past the pandemic to hire lab technicians to go out and continue monitoring the experiment. And once we got all the plants planted and the deer fences set up and everything else, it's actually a relatively low maintenance experiment. And I think we have 1 or 2 years where we don't have data, but we're gonna actually go back out this spring. Mason's hiring some interns. So the long-term research is really hard to do in ecology because a lot of grants are 3 years, so they can fund the initial startup, but then the researchers have to figure out how to keep funding the people to get out. So we saw the benefit of keeping this running for a long time, and we have found someone who's going to help us with all the data wrangling. Great. Happy to take any other questions on this before we go to forest carbon too.
Do growth chambers mimic photoperiod also? Do lights come on?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Yeah, the growth chambers, we can change the light levels, and we can change both the amount of light, which I think we just kept standard. I don't think we tried to match natural light levels, but we kept them consistent across both growth chambers. But we did change daylight. So you're able, right, to turn the lights on and off to mimic daylight. And so we did have a semi-realistic progression sort of every week. The days got longer to mimic that.
How does early leaf out from non-native species impact soil moisture?
So that's a great question. My guess is I guess the guess is it might dry out the soils a little bit faster, because as soon as plants leaf out and they're photosynthesizing, they're moving moisture from the soil, their roots up, because they're always releasing it. One of the things Olivia actually wants to do, I'm not sure how excited she is about my hundreds of thousands of rows of data, but one of the things she's actually excited about doing is doing some of those more ecosystem measurements of looking at temperature changes and carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling changes, because I also think there's a lot of soil impacts of these invasive shrubs that are leafing out sooner. They're also accessing nutrient resources in the soil before anything else in the forest wake up. They're adding carbon to the soil earlier, and so there might be these sort of long-term effects that are happening in the soil that I don't think people have tracked, because it would require setting up long-term plots and measuring year on year what's going on. But we're hoping to start doing some of that with Olivia, so it's a great question.
Do you ever measure leaf area index, or is it always photosynthetic active radiation? People like more.
Yeah. So Mason's our ecophysiologist. I think he did do some. We have some leaf area index of the canopies, but I don't think we have anything underneath the shrubs. We just had the par. We do have a bunch of, like, a lot of the ecophysiological measurements on the wildflowers are, putting the leaves inside the chamber and looking at the various, like, carbon dioxide flow rates in them. And we're seeing some changes with that, but we haven't really dug into that data because there's 20 different species across the plots.
Do you ever look at root growth and phenology of root growth and productivity?
That would be, we're not doing that because that would require the destructive sampling. So maybe we'll see if we don't find anything, or we decide we want to destructively sample. They now have like things you can put into the soil to measure root growth, and so you sort of bury a clear plastic. Maybe it doesn't work very well. So.
Well, I did root productivity for my work, and it's like every time you do anything in the soil, it changes the environment, and thus what you have is moisture differences between what you're measuring on that glass.
Oh, yeah.
And the root tends to go along the glass, and you get a kind of a bias.
Yeah.
Sample.
Yeah, root stuff is really hard. I did some stuff in the greenhouse, but it's in the greenhouse in a pot, so it becomes, really challenging. So, but maybe we will destructively harvest some of them at the end of this just to see if there's any differences. Yeah. Cool. All right. Want to talk about forest carbon? I'll try to go a little bit. I went a little bit slower. So this next project that I'll chat to, Mike, we have till 5:30. Is that the?
Yeah,
5:30. Okay. I'll move a little bit quicker through this. I'll just share some of this. So this is some of our newer work. This was a project led by a postdoc where I'm framing it as reconciling competing forest carbon narratives, but it's about managing forests and making decisions, especially southern New England forest. And so there's a lot of talk right now about what is the role of forest in climate mitigation and carbon. And these are a series of New York Times op-eds that came out probably within a year and a half of one another. And I think they really perfectly embody these like deep, strong feelings that people have. And so we have these sort of like grim and pessimistic narratives about forests are no longer our climate friends. They're burning up. They're not going to hold on to the carbon. We can't rely on them anymore. We have these really strong sort of preservationist narratives of it costs nothing It costs nothing to leave our trees as they are. So these narratives that the best thing that we can do for forests and climate is to do nothing and to leave them alone. And then we have these really strong sort of that was conservationist narratives, these like preservationist narratives that say we can actively manage these forests. Let's fill our cities with taller wooden buildings so we can manage these forests for resilience and for health. We can build things out of wood products and build stronger economies. And all of these narratives are percolating all around the world, but especially here in southern New England, about what are the questions of what we should do with our forests in terms of climate change. And so today I wanted to just ask the question of whether data can reconcile these competing narratives. And I think there's two lessons that we can take from these different narratives that are really important. If people are saying, like, there's all these climate disturbances that are causing us to lose carbon, then when we try to think about what's going to happen in the future with our forest, we need to actually include realistic disturbances into any projection models that we do. Because if we're not including those disturbances, then we're not capturing what is most likely going to happen on the landscape. The other lesson is that forest management options are wide of what we can do, and when we build models for trying to guess what's going to happen in the future, we need to have a realistic span of management options so we can really understand the whole scope. And I'll say a lot of studies that look into this, they rarely include disturbances. They sort of just assume business as usual, weather patterns, and growth. And they frequently leave out the less preferred management option, depending on who the author is. If what they want to see, they change their management options. And so this is what we did for that DOE report. We did a series of case studies. I'm just sharing one, but a postdoc in our group looked at southern New England, so Massachusetts, Connecticut, and I know it's not New England, but we were able to get data from the Department of New York City Water Conservation that had a lot of forest inventory plots, so we included some of right outside of the Hudson Valley, the hardwood forests up there. And we asked, can we reconcile some of these competing narratives for southern New England? And so if our first lesson is that we have to think about what are the disturbances that we're likely to see in our forest if we want to project out how much carbon they're going to store in the future, then what do we see here in southern New England? And by far, these maps here are showing carbon loss to disturbances for every county in the United States. And when we look at carbon loss, we see that windstorms cause a lot of carbon loss, definitely in the southeastern United States, but also up here in New England. And the next slide will go into that. And here in New England, we are at the epicenter of pests, pathogens, and disease causing carbon loss. And I know Great Mountain Forest has been dealing with that really recently. So these are two of the major pressing disturbances that we see on the landscape now and that we expect to continue to see on the landscape moving forward. And so I know the Southeast dominates those carbon loss maps, but we have lots of great examples of really devastating windstorms. We have the hurricane of 1938. We can still see legacies of that hurricane out on the landscape today. In New Haven, when Sandy came through, remember Sandy hit down in New Jersey, didn't even have a direct hit up on our coastline, but we lost a bunch of huge trees on the New Haven Green, including this one, which unearthed a skeleton from one of the grave sites that was there before. So some poor Yale College undergrads, I think, were some of the first to report to the police that there was a skeleton dangling in the roots of a tree. The pictures on the right are a microburst at one of our local state parks, Sleeping Giant, just right north of New Haven. You can see the funnel that I feel so scared for those hikers who took that picture and got caught up there in that storm, but it knocked down about 3,000 pine trees at the base of the mountain, which you can see right there. And these microbursts are really common, so a stand can experience these like localized windstorms. As probably most of you know, we've got a whole suite of pest pathogens and diseases that we have here in southern New England. Our emerald ash borer, our beech bark disease coupled with beech leaf disease, and our spongy moth. They affect different species. They can leave a forest looking like this of a bunch of dead deciduous trees interspersed with them. We see mortality, and that means carbon loss in the long term on the landscape. Like I said, we also have a lot of debates here. So a couple years ago, there was a huge political argument about whether Massachusetts should be cutting its state forest or not. That really exemplified some of these narratives. This was pulled out from the Boston Globe sort of counter op-eds, where we have authors writing to halt the pace of global warming. We need to stop logging public lands right now. Massachusetts had a moratorium on cutting for a while the governor was making a decision on what to do. And we, of course, had narratives also, sort of the counter op-ed. This mix of forest reserves and forests managed with climate-smart forestry techniques are the best strategy for maximizing carbon sequestration and storage over the long time. So right here in Massachusetts, these debates are populating. And so what we wanted to do, where led this study and all of the modeling, was to use some models to try to understand, well, what could be the possibility that would happen? And so Ware took all these inventory plots from the gray and black dots that I realize are probably hard to see on this screen, and then we put them through a bunch of different scenarios. We put them through 3 different management scenarios and 3 different disturbance scenarios. And we asked, what is going to happen to the forest in the long run under these different scenarios? And so specifically, we looked at a no-harvest scenario where we didn't remove any trees. They went through their natural growth and death cycles as predicted by the model, sort of under this let's not touch the forest and just let them grow idea. We then also modeled out 2 different types of harvest scenarios, one that we called an exploitation harvest, which was really maximizing short-term economic gains. We see that happening a lot in southern New England, especially when people just go out and contract loggers without working with a state forester. We also modeled out a sustainable harvest scenario, which was shelter wood cuts, which are really designed not just to provide economic income, but to also regenerate a more diverse forest understory after the cut by actually opening up the canopy more, potentially leaving some big seed trees there to repopulate in the area. We also then modeled out a bunch of different disturbance scenarios. We modeled out this no disturbance scenario, so the only thing killing trees were natural death and mortality. We modeled out an extreme weather scenario where we had one big microburst or hurricane come through at year 40. We had actually extreme drought in there as well. Every 10 years we had a punctuated drought, which reduced productivity. And then we did a third scenario, which was adding on all those pest and pathogens from the earlier slide with our extreme weather. And so here's what we found, and before I start populating this, I'll walk you again through this slide. Our model that we used was the U.S. Forest Service Forest Vegetation Simulation Models. It allowed us to model out 100 years from our starting point. So we have our years after management activity on the x-axis on the bottom, and then on the right axis I'm going to show you some lines of carbon storage, and that's carbon in the forest, so forest carbon that's changing. So as we grow out these forests from these inventories, as we apply these different disturbances and these different management activities, what happens to the carbon? And so for each of these plots, you're going to see lots of different colors. These are what we call different carbon pools. This is where the carbon lives in the forest. It might be in living trees, it might be in dead trees, it might be in dead trees that have fallen to the ground, and it might be in the roots that don't even ask me how they do these modeling simulations on the roots, because you'll be real sad. But it could be in living tree roots and dead tree roots, and these are all components of how the model gives us data and answers. And so what do we find? Okay, so in our no disturbance scenario, which is represented here on the right, harvesting reduces total forest carbon. So what you can see is that big green living tree patch on the top left panel where there's no harvest. As we harvest and remove trees, we are losing carbon from that landscape. And after 100 years, we see that under the exploitative harvest, we have about 71% of the total carbon at 100 years. Under sustainable harvest, we're getting closer. We have about 92% of the harvest. Okay, so that's under no disturbance across these management scenarios. And so, right, here's some nice data that shows us, is the best strategy to leave our trees alone? Well, if you're maximizing carbon and you have no disturbances in your forest stand, then here you go. Here's some data to show you that that's what's going to happen. But I would actually argue it's a really rosy picture, and this is maybe a good group to say, where you're seeing beech leaf disease right now in your forest, along with a lot of other pests and pathogens. It's not very realistic to expect nothing else to kill the trees, right? It's a really rosy picture. And so probably this no disturbance scenario doesn't maybe give us as much insight as what's going to happen as we would hope. Okay, so what happens when we start introducing more mortality from these disturbances like extreme weather? I'm just showing you here in the no harvest scenario that our model is working, because at year 40, when that big storm comes through that we simulate, we get this big spike in standing dead trees. All those trees have now died from that storm. They're going to eventually fall over and move through those carbon pools in the model. So just a little bit proof of concept that we're happy that the model is doing what we think it's doing. So again, these forests are no longer our climate friends. We can also say when we compare our carbon under this disturbance scenario to the no disturbance scenario, we're also losing carbon. We're going to lose carbon in our forest under these disturbance scenarios because trees are going to die. They're not going to grow as fast. But what happens with management? I think we start to see more hopeful pictures when we start overlaying what's happening with management versus these extreme weather. And so those red lines represent the curve of the no harvest scenario, the total carbon in the forest, just looking under the different management scenarios. And so what you can see is that under management, early on, before let's say 25, 50 years, we have less carbon because we're removing trees from the landscape. But I think we see some hopeful scenarios that after 100 years, those sustainable harvests that we see, we're actually seeing growing diversity in the forest, which is not data that I'm presenting right now. But we also see that carbon stocks are actually higher. They're more resilient to these extreme weather events under our sustainable harvest scenario than we even see in the no harvest scenario. So we are seeing some regain of carbon despite these. If we add on those pests and pathogens, so now we have trees that are not only experiencing extreme weather, but they're experiencing increased mortality from those pests and pathogens, we again see we lose more carbon as trees die. But we can still see that same pattern that under our sustainable management scenario, we are starting to regain some of the carbon. And so I think one lesson that we can pull from here is that sustainable forest management may help us increase forest resilience to some of these disturbances. But what I haven't shown you here is sort of what, and this is where a lot of foresters say, whoa, this is not the full picture. Is our carbon accounting scope complete? What I haven't shown you is wood products, right? So this has just so far been forest carbon in the forest. But when we harvest those forests, presumably those trees get taken and they get put into something. And if they get put into something, whether it's plywood or it's a really nice dining room table that someone's going to cherish for their whole lives, then those products are also storing carbon. And so this model does allow us to track wood products, so that taken from the wood, both wood products that eventually get thrown away because they're shorter term use, or wood products that are in use. And so you can now see as we add wood products in as carbon storage that some of these harvest scenarios, and we're going back up to just the no disturbance scenario, after 100 years, about 99% of the carbon is still either in the forest or in wood products compared to the no harvest scenario. And so when we think about, can we reconcile these competing narratives? So remember, these are just projections and models of what's happening in the future. We don't actually know what's going to happen in the future. Are we going to have a hurricane next year? Is it going to be in 10 years? Are we going to have cyclical droughts every 10 years? A lot of that we don't know. But what this does is it gives us a really range of scope of what could happen, from sort of extreme to, really optimistic. And so I think data like this really helps us reconcile these competing narratives to say that none of the narratives are wrong, none of the narratives are right. A lot of them have to do with what time frames we're talking about, what we're prioritizing, and also what our anticipation of what the future is going to be like. So I'll let you all decide. You can sort of take what you want from these data, and I'm happy to put it back up for you. And just to finalize this section, Eli Ward has a fan club in the audience, which I didn't even know when I was putting these slides together. I'm really excited. Mike and Eli Ward, who's a forest ecologist with the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, and who I believe was here just a few weeks ago talking to you all if you were here. We are embarking on what I hope will be a really great collaborative to take on this sort of same modeling structure, but ask more specific questions about what's happening right here in Northwest Connecticut, and in particular with beech leaf disease. And so Eli has been doing a lot of really great work over the past couple of years, actually tracking beech growth and productivity and mortality in response to beech leaf infection as it is spreading through the state. So she has some great data sets that could help us to parameterize these models. And Mike has been talking to us about what he's been seeing here at Great Mountain Forest out on the landscape. And so right now we are just starting small. We have a master's student, Toby, and a research scientist in my group, Michelle, who are building out some of these models, specifically using inventory data from right around here at Great Mountain Forest, where we'll do those same toggling of sort of the severity of beech leaf disease, and also some potential management options that people are talking about on the landscape to give us a picture of what it could look like our forests in the future underneath these. And so I'm really excited about this work. We're thinking about funding sources and applying to some various grants to sort of make this bigger and better, where we could even start doing some empirical field research, maybe doing some management and tracking what happens on the landscape in real time. But this is sort of a budding project that I'm really excited about here. And so with that, I think I'm not too far off on time, and so I'm happy to take some carbon questions from anyone who has them. So right here, Tom.
Yeah, I noticed an absence in the discussion on the tree-killing line, Asiatic bittersweet, which for a project that I'm working on for the Sharon Land Trust has defeated 1/3 of a conifer forest of some 480 trees, of which there are 166 were enveloped, collapsed, and due to release carbon, certainly. I'm observing in Falls Village, in Salisbury, and in Sharon, collapsing forests, or the edge of the cancer that's about to sweep in.
Yeah.
My suggestion is kill every bittersweet vine you see, because it will produce thousands of seeds and replicate to the point of dominating as a monoculture over an entire forest. We have the photographs to show that.
Yeah.
And it really needs, and I have not gotten responses back from Carrie Arboretum on this question, or Woods Hole research. I think it's a underappreciated threat.
Yeah, well, I'll connect you. So there was a Nature Conservancy researcher who did a pretty rough back-of-the-envelope calculation for not here in temperate forest, but down in tropical forest, where you have a lot of vines and lianas that are all native, but they're part of the canopy, part of the sort of natural tropical ecosystem. But they also reduce tree growth. They both by preventing photosynthesis, and also they're just really heavy, and it's hard for the trees to literally grow with these heavy vines on them. And I can't remember the numbers now, but they came up with basically a big number. If you removed all the lianas in tropical forest, how much more carbon would you get out of your trees? You might not want to do that in a tropical forest where they're actually part of the native biodiversity. But because of that paper, we do have a PhD student working with Mark Ashton right now at the Forest School who is thinking about vines in temperate ecosystems and looking at vines like grapevines, but also looking at invasive vines like bittersweet on their impacts on forest carbon and growth. And he's doing a lot of remote sensing work to sort of track where these are across the landscape, and then taking a lot of measurements to get at it. So I don't think he's published anything yet, but I'd be happy to connect you with Jacob to talk about what he's doing.
If I understood what you were saying is, if you want to do carbon capture, forget about the money side of it. If you have a forest, if you do nothing to it, or if you do a managed program, whatever it is you want to do, and your objective is to maximize carbon capture, then you'd be better off doing the managed forest program. So then my question is, how big a forest, how many acres of forest do you need to have to be able to make a difference? Or where it actually starts making sense?
For climate change, or just
Carbon
for...
capture. I'm just thinking about carbon capture.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, people have pulled up those big numbers on, you know, if we did improved forest or climate smart forest management across really large acres, how much carbon will we get, and then how much per acre. So I could get back to you on that. I think, for me, I think using forests just for carbon capture, right? Forests do a lot for us, and I didn't add those slides in here. And so I think maximizing carbon will come at a cost of minimizing other things that we care about. So probably maximizing just for carbon is not 100% the right way to think about forest management and how much you're gonna get. But I think you can make substantial differences. I think here in the Northeast, though, I think building out resiliency and health through really thoughtful management that provides provides the forest with some opportunities to regrow in the face of some of these disturbances is actually a more compelling reason to think about management than just the carbon alone. Because as actually some of my colleagues pointed out, when I was showing you that regain, we're almost getting to 100% of the carbon after 100 years, you have to have a lot of faith in these models that they're accurately predicting what's going to happen in 100 years, which you probably actually shouldn't have faith in that. But the other thing is you've still lost carbon, right? There's still sort of more carbon in that untouched, undisturbed forest, which I don't think is a realistic forest for us right now, unfortunately. So I think there's probably some forests that we should probably do relatively little in, but some that are probably degraded and would really benefit from some management.
So, do we understand how much carbon is allocated to below ground biomass, and then how much carbon exodus are produced on a tree basis, on an acre basis?
No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, if someone really tells you confidently that they know, I think though big picture directions, like the less disturbed the soils in a forest and the older the forest is, the more carbon you will have. The question about like the carbon leachate is a really good one. I think soil scientists, I work with a couple soil scientists, they're just now figuring out how important that carbon leachate is to the soil carbon, ecosystem relative to litter fall. But people put numbers on it, it's really rough. Carbon markets don't really credit for soil carbon.
Right.
They don't try to touch
Nobody
it
knows.
because it's just there's not enough evidence out there. I think the forest vegetation simulator has some really, it's like they just take the size of the tree and they assume that there's, I don't know, it's like 75% of that tree above ground is below ground and living, and I'm not sure how they're doing.
I mean, in North Carolina, we've done some really good measures. We did some really good measurements on partitioning and allocation.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, like, as the climate warms up, your nighttime metabolism of the trees is increasing. So you're losing carbon as the climate warms.
Yeah, and the metabolism of those soil microbes that are responding. So those feedbacks are really messy, and these larger like climate simulation models are really sort of stretching our understanding of like what we think is going to happen. So, questions.
Also, one last comment. I lived in Costa Rica for 4 years as a forester, and I think one of the most effective ways we can actually reforest a lot of our tropical forests is actually just allowing secondary growth. I've walked days and days and days, miles and miles and miles through secondary growth forests. I don't think lianas and vines are going to inhibit tree growth and tree productivity that much down there.
Yeah. It's a good question. I brought up a paper that I don't know, I really haven't dug too much into the methods on of whether they were looking at secondary forest or primary forest. But again, these are all rough, back of the envelope calculations of how much they think. Yeah. Well, you're also not going to go across like all of Brazil and clip all of the vines. So it was sort of one of these like big splashy papers that the action item on it seems hard. So, yeah.
I mean, just economically, it's impossible to
Yeah.
reforest.
But coming back to the bittersweet, and also there's a plant called hardy kiwi, which I saw a site up in Pomfret that we were working with the Pomfret School and writing management plans as part of one of the forestry classes. I have never seen a site like that before. It looks worse than the bittersweet. It's doing that same sort of like canopy collapse. So I do think in the Northeast in stands that have these really obscene vine loads, we are seeing that loss.
We got a few minutes left.
Yeah.
Let's open up for a few other questioners.
I was really interested in your 9-box grid, and sort of on the assumption, may not be right, that the lowest scenario is the most likely scenario with most disturbances and pests and so forth.
Yeah.
As being the most likely. It seemed like there was very little difference in the three scenarios: the unmanaged, the exploitation, and the managed. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the implications of that, What do you take away from that? And in particular, the wood products in use, I was surprised not to see that line, expand more. Maybe I'm not interpreting the graph correctly, but can you just sort of talk a little more about those different scenarios?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, so there's actually two things, so the scenario that we ran in all of these when we had extreme weather was like that big sort of like hurricane or devastating like microburst, high mortality event, which is that like light green spike that you see in those forests. And so then those are all standing dead trees. The way the model works is because those are standing dead trees, they're actually still blocking a lot of light, they're taking up a lot of space. And so the model isn't recruiting out the seedlings and saplings as well as maybe it would. It's sort of just assuming this I'm not sure what the decay rate is, but the standing dead tree is going to stand for so many years before it falls and, physically creating space for new ones. And so I think one reason you don't see as big of a difference between the harvest strategies is because you're getting slower recruitment in the forest. And whether that tracks with these scenarios, these are really sort of simplified models of forest growth and yield that haven't really been trained on any data that we actually see in response. It's sort of just guessing who's going to grow at what growth rate depending on the seedling inventories that we had across all those plots. So that might be why there's just not as much available to harvest once all those standing dead trees are dead. So that's why you're not seeing the increase here, because there's nothing harvestable that they're removing. We also have punctuated drought, which you can see sort of the jaggedy lines there, and that's causing a lot of mortality as well and moving in. So it doesn't look good, but this is also a stand that's had a major hurricane, drought every 10 years, emerald ash borer, the 2 beech leaf disease, and spongy moth. I think all those were, spongy moth was periodic too, and I can't remember what it was. So this is a really hard hit forest stand simulated there. So this is probably hopefully this actually isn't what we're gonna see. It'll be some moderation between, but it was really sort of testing the extremes. I don't know.
Another way to interpret some of those is even though is that if you looked in percentage terms, there seems to be a sort of percentage improvement in cargo storage in the sustainable harvest. I mean, it's not as rosy as the top line,
Right.
but that third column in every case, the sustainable harvest scenario is significantly better than the other. Well, at least the no harvest.
And one other thing that we did in this model that also affects that. So actually, when you harvest relative to the disturbance is really important insofar as we harvested at year 1 in the model if we were harvesting. So they went in at the model went in at year 1 and removed all the harvestable material, and then we had at year 40 that major windstorm event, and so the harvested stands had fewer big trees to die because they had already been removed because the mortality was higher for bigger trees in those. And so some of these are just symptoms of how we modeled. If we had done the harvest after the storm, it would have been a slightly different picture, which would have been a lot more grids to show to you. We didn't do that, but it might be worthwhile.
So maybe one more question?
Just a comment on vines. Hardy kiwi was very popular in Berkshire County 100 years ago and ravages Lenox and to the north. Porcelainberry was exceedingly popular in Sharon, Connecticut, and is second to bittersweet. So there's a pattern out there that's just a cultural point of interest as how those plants got there. The nursery trade.
Yeah, well, actually, the nursery trade does bring things in. The USDA also is responsible for the introduction of a lot of the species. There was a whole office started around the Civil War where they sent out botanists all around the world to collect useful species for the United States, and a lot, autumn olive, kudzu for down south. There's a lot of species that we see in our forests now that the USDA actually brought back because they thought they had erosion benefits, wildlife habitat benefits, that they not only brought the seeds back but propagated and handed out to landowners to plant multiflora rows as a hedgerow. So yes, it is intentional. Humans are responsible for introducing a lot of these species.